Good afternoon. I hope I'm visible from here. Thank you for the introduction and thank you so much for having us here. I am Somya. I'm here with my colleague Sagarika. We are research fellows at Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, where we work with the Disability Inclusion and Access team. Our team last month released a report called From Barriers to Bridges, a roadmap for inclusive school education in India. In this presentation, we'll briefly share the key findings of the report with you. So, for decades, children with disabilities were either segregated or excluded from the education system. This changed when the Right to Education Act and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act came into force, which recognized the right of children with disabilities to inclusive education, which means they can study with other children in inclusive settings. Now in 2025, years after RTE and RPWD, has the situation truly changed? Unfortunately, it isn't. There are 65 lakh children with disabilities living in India. Only 21 lakh are enrolled in school. Where does the gap lie? To what extent the RTE and the RPWD, the promises that they have made, how much have they delivered? To answer these questions, we started our research. We divided our research into 5 parts, which are 5 critical aspects of a child with disability school life. That is early identification and intervention, disability certification, accessibility, capacity of educators, and reasonable accommodation. So for each of these areas, we started by making a list of all laws and policies that are relevant to that topic, and we put all of those provisions at one place. Then we started identifying gaps why these provisions are not being implemented. As Sir pointed out in the beginning, it all boils down to implementation. So why these provisions are not being implemented? We conducted research, we spoke with number of stakeholders working on ground, such as educators, teachers, Anganwadi workers, among others. And we came to this conclusion, which is both concerning yet expected, that the laws in India for inclusive education are poorly operationalized. And at the same time, there is no mechanism or guidance on how the law can be operationalized. So to address this gap, we thought of preparing a roadmap. So for all the 5 areas that we have identified, we have prepared a roadmap which has actionable recommendations, which basically details how the provisions in the law can be operationalized, what action are needed to be taken, who will implement these actions, when they should do it, and who will monitor the progress. So this all consolidated, culminated into our report, and today Sagarika and I will discuss the 5 chapters of the report with examples of the gaps we have identified in implementation and the recommendations we have shared in our roadmap. So starting with the first one, which is early identification. This is the first chapter, early identification of disabilities and early intervention. So this assumes importance even before a child is enrolled in a school. So early identification basically refers to identifying disabilities in children as early as possible. And early intervention becomes important once a child is identified with a disability. It is to provide the child with early support, maybe in form of therapies or school readiness programs, to prepare them for the school life ahead. Now there are various laws and provisions, government programs for this issue. However, why they are not being implemented properly, one of the reasons that we found was capacity of the stakeholders who are responsible for identifying disabilities in children, such as regular teachers or Anganwadi workers. One of the recommendations for this issue was capacity building, proper training of educators and Anganwadi workers. We took an example of Prashast Tech Checklist. So Prashast Checklist is a tool developed by the NCERT to identify disabilities in school children, which is to be administered by the teachers. Now in our roadmap, we have provided in way of a recommendation how the precious checklist should be administered, how the teacher should administer in the classroom, who will ensure that the teacher knows how to do it, who will ensure that training has done, who will eventually train the educators, and what all components will be there in their training. All of this information, how it should be done, is there in the roadmap. Now, the second chapter, that is disability certification. This is the next logical step once a child is identified with a disability. This is very important for a child for obtaining rights and entitlements under the law. It can be in a form of disability certificate or a UDID card, as we all know. One issue that people and parents who are trying to get disability certification for their children encounter is that the process of certification is very long and complex. There are not enough medical facilities, the doctors are not there, it's taking too much time than one has expected. So one recommendation for this issue was a school can facilitate disability certification. So now, as per DEPWD, the head of school in every school is responsible for facilitating disability certification. They can, how they can do it is there in the roadmap. They can coordinate with the district administration to organize disability certification camps. They can refer the children who are identified in school to medical authorities and certification camps. Teachers can also provide guidance to parents on about the process and how it should be done. For the remaining 3 chapters, my colleague Sagarika will take on from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Somya. I apologize upfront for my voice. All I need to tell you is I've flown down from Delhi, and I know you'll get it. Oops. Right, so the next large issue that we identified was accessibility of school environments. Now, under the RTE Act, all a school is required to do to create an accessible school environment is give a one-time declaration saying that they are barrier-free. What does barrier-free mean? How long have you been barrier-free? Have you continued being barrier-free after getting your certification? Nobody is checking that. Although the RPWDA mandates some accessibility guidelines for all public buildings, along with special accessibility guidelines for educational institute. I'm sure most of us haven't even heard of them, let alone schools trying to follow them, comply with them, and ensure their certification also includes meeting these guidelines. No government officials are checking if schools have met these guidelines, and no registration or certification of schools is rescinded if they do not meet these guidelines. So of course this is a massive issue in ensuring that schools are incentivized to meet accessibility standards. Now you and I can do very little in this, of course. This is a thing that needs to change in the law itself. But seeing that here there are lots of stakeholders who are really active, we have identified a couple of things that we can do as educators and heads of schools. One is to have regular audits in schools to understand what the child actually needs. There may be 20 accessibility requirements under the law, but let's at least start with understanding what are the basic needs of a child which is already in my school. So our suggestion is to have accessibility audits which can be used to get adequate funds from the government to demand that there is accessibility in schools. The next large issue that we identified was a gap in teacher training and capacity of educators. Again, the Right to Education Act mandates that there has to be a set pupil-teacher ratio for special educators. However, it's a very short-sighted provision with a very rigid application. For example, imagine in your school if there is a child with autism and there is a child with visual disabilities. As a special educator, I might not be equipped to deal with this range of support that a child needs. So, the pupil-teacher ratio doesn't necessarily solve for the support that every kind of child with disability might need. Again, we understand that this is a minimum mandated by law, and it is on the stakeholders to go above and beyond to ensure that this is followed. What can teachers and school educators and principals do in this case? What we realized that there have been some instances of good practices where schools have formed clusters where they share resources, where educators can move from one school to the other based on the need of the child, which means that the financial burden on hiring educators of all different kinds of disability is reduced. At the same time, a child with disability with different needs will get all the support they need. Moving to the last issue that we identified, and perhaps the most important, is on reasonable accommodations. As we all might know, reasonable accommodations are individualized support that a child with disability needs, which is over and above everything that the law provides for them, as long as the institution does not have any undue burden when providing this. Say for example, if I need a scribe while writing an exam, that is a reasonable accommodation that a school provides. But if I was to ask you all today, what is your idea of reasonable accommodation? These are usually the answers we get. Oh, we provide a screen reader. We provide the child with extra time during an exam. We provide the child with a scribe. Very rarely do teachers imagine reasonable accommodation as something beyond examinations, something beyond, something which includes classroom accommodation as well, something which is not suddenly given to a child in a 10th grade board examination and high pressure. The issue here is that a child is not prepared at all to use these reasonable accommodations when they reach a place where they finally might receive something. Other than that, of course, the idea of accommodation is so limited that something that a child might need during classroom is not getting provided at all. What can you and I do in this? As Vidhi, we have also been trying to work on this a lot. We have been trying to go to individual stakeholders to see if we can help them make reasonable accommodation policies for their respective institutions so that they cover everything under the law. It's not limited to children with benchmark disabilities. It's not limited to something that the CBSE might mandate only for 10th and 12th grade examinations. And it's not limited to something that's only for assessments. Just to quickly summarize, I know we're running out of time, thank you so much, but just to quickly summarize some broad trends that we realized through this research. The biggest problem, as everyone's been talking about, is translating policy into actionable outcomes on ground. There's a lot of laws which are at international standards, but they're not getting translated. The other thing being that they're very willing stakeholders like all of you here, but they are very unsure about what roles they have to fulfill necessarily in inclusion. There are, of course, capacity and training gaps, and the biggest is a systemic issue where the government bodies are not able to coordinate with each other when it comes to education and disability, and of course, some things fall through the crack. I would obviously refer you to our report, and I hope you all read it. We have some copies here if you want. But the roadmap that we have developed has a comprehensive mode of implementation where we talk about targeted training for special educators and for school teachers, enhance infrastructure and staffing in schools, and most importantly, clear accountability. What roles is each stakeholder playing and how they can fulfill it the best they can. That is it from us today. I hope this has been a helpful presentation. Sir, would you like to?
Something unbelievable happened. Every session, you run out of time. Here we have saved time. Somya has saved 3 minutes and Sagarika has saved 5 minutes. Imagine 2 young speakers Something, you notice something very interesting? These are the youngest speakers of the 3 days. And maybe also the oldest chairperson of 3 days. Now we have time for questions. In fact, there is very, very pertinent questions. Just to brief you, they started with capacity building. Good point. Unless we have the capacity of the school, of the system, nothing can happen. They talked of facilities, how to make the facilities accessible, not only the ramps and the examination, but the whole environment. And they really spoke very well about good practices, listing good practices for teacher training, way of following and all. And also, I appreciate is the reasonable accommodation. Yesterday also we saw, and I must congratulate you for understanding this term in a very perfect manner. Both are lawyers, they're bound to understand, but very young lawyers. So with this, and the last point which really strikes a chord is the peer accountability. Fantastic. If you can achieve all these 5 points, our system will be more efficient. Now, if you have any questions to these 2 young upcoming lawyers and the speakers, please, floor is yours. Yeah, there are 1, 2. Yeah, oh, Kanchan, you have come. Come the dais. Now the chairperson has come. Please come. She's my dear friend. As she could not come on time, I could fill the gap. Come, Kanchan, come to the dais. Please come. No, please come. People like to see you.
She has a session after this.
Okay, very good. Kanchan is a very, very leading lawyer in Mumbai High Court, and I'm very proud of her. She is doing extremely well on her own. She's a role model for this country. Congratulations, Kanchan. Can you stand up?
Yes. My question
Can
to
you
both
give
the
a big
speakers.
clap to her, being a role model for this country?
Okay, my question to the speakers is, somewhere you have to build in the role of flexibility also, because I have benefit from flexible rules and regulations, not tight rules and regulations, So somewhere each child which comes in is slightly different from the next. Okay, so when you write your papers, we write it in, what the law should be, what the law gives us. But there is that whole gamut of flexibility. So somewhere all of y'all need to look at that, because I have succeeded with that. So have you all got something in it for flexibility in your papers right now? So that's all I want to ask.
Hello.
Thank you, Kanchan ma'am. It's so nice to meet you. It's such a great question you ask. I think where the methodology we usually use in our papers is that when we're writing about the law, we like to be idealistic. Yes, the laws guarantees rights, and you cannot have any compromises in that. When you're drafting a legislation which is providing absolute rights to persons with disabilities, there is a need to have the most amount of responsibility on a government as need be. But we totally understand your point that when that law is operationalized in different contexts, and requires different, let's say, compromises in different cases, we absolutely understand that it's not possible to implement it to the letter of the law. Which is why, for example, a lot of our recommendations also say that, okay, we know that right now the pupil-teacher ratio is 1:15. It's very difficult maybe for all schools to meet that. What if there are 16 students? For one extra student, will I get an extra special educator? Maybe not. But then maybe you form that cluster of schools where maybe a neighborhood school, which is barely 2 kilometers away from yours, is able to provide that extra educator to you. So yes, under the law, the bare minimum guarantees have to be clear. But just like Kanchan ma'am says, when you and I are implementing the law, we are the people taking the decisions on what is the best for the child who is at the end the beneficiary of the law.
Thank you. We'll take only one more question because of the paucity of time. Something on the last row. Last benches should be given a chance. Somebody can take the mic to the last row. And yeah, as distance is too far, we need the mic for her to speak. Here you are.
So, sorry. When we talk about reasonable accommodations, especially under RW, like rights of people with disabilities, it's usually only the benchmark disabilities. So when it comes to, say, chronic disorders, you have multiple sclerosis, you have Parkinson's, and that's it. What about the huge gamut of, say, autoimmune disorders that people live with? Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia. I think that the law needs to rethink its idea of disability itself. So, especially in India, because you like on an international front, it has happened. We have changed our definition of disability, but in India, we are still stuck to, say, a couple of known, arenas of disability. So, how do we work towards expanding what disability itself is?
Thank you so much. That was such a great question, actually. And you actually brought in a point that I forgot to mention during my presentation, so you caught me. The law, actually, you'd be surprised to know that the law actually does have a provision to provide reasonable accommodations for all children with disabilities. You could be a child with autism on the spectrum who is not close to a child with a benchmark disability. Just to clarify, benchmark disability means that in your disability certification, you're recorded to have 40% of more of the disability. So under the law, there is no differentiation between a child with disability and a child with benchmark disability for reasonable accommodation. So a teacher who's teaching a child with autism in a classroom, if that child needs a quiet space because they are not able to sit with all the other children, it is completely reasonable for that child to ask for that, and it is the duty of the teacher to provide that. Except our law is so complicated that, for example, the CBSE has come out with guidelines which only specify persons with children with benchmark disabilities. So of course there is a lot of things that need to change in the law, but I think our endeavor here today was to even if 100 of you were to go back with the idea that yes, it is my duty to provide reasonable accommodation to every child with disability in my classroom, I think that's where the change can begin.
Thank you very much. Actually, just to congratulate both of them, they mentioned two terms in the beginning. Somya mentioned early intervention and also school readiness program. You all will be surprised. This both are part of our new national education policy. The four departures which the policy does, two are the early intervention and school readiness program, and other one child preparatory services. I must congratulate them. It's not only the RTE they have touched, and the ROPWD Act they have touched, they also touched the new national policy on education. So I think they've done a lot of hard homework. Please give them a big clap. And another thing which they really rightly pointed out is the responsibility of the school to go for certification, which is a very valid point. And last and most important, regular access audit and asking money for that. I think they're very beautiful points. Kindly give them a clap once again. And with that, we conclude the session by thanking them.